The wind moved through the black mountains like a living thing, slipping cold fingers through the trees and carrying with it a smell Lena hadn't breathed in since childhood: wet earth, pine sap, and something faintly metallic, like old rust or dried blood. She stood at the edge of the forest, suitcase in hand, watching the narrow dirt road disappear into shadows that felt thicker than night. It wasn't just darkness, it was a presence. A welcome. A warning. The cabin sat deeper in the woods than she remembered, half swallowed by creeping vines and sagging beneath years of silence. Her mother had vanished from this place when Lena was only 7, leaving behind no body, no note, only townsfolk who lowered their voices whenever Lena asked questions. Returning now felt like stepping into a held breath, a place frozen in the moment before a scream. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been: a coffee cup resting on its side, a sweater slumped across the couch, a half-finished journal on the table, as though her mother might walk back in at any second. But there was something else too, something Lena didn't remember: the sensation of being watched. It pressed in from the trees, the walls, even the dust-filled corners. A soft whisper rose with the wind, brushing her ear, almost tender. "Welcome home." Lena staggered back, heart pounding, but the voice melted into the rustling leaves. She told herself she was just tired, that memories were playing tricks on her. Yet as she explored the cabin, she felt the woods leaning closer, listening. The photographs on the mantel seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. Her mother's smile stretched a little too wide, her eyes following Lena across the room. Night fell quickly, smothering the mountain in a darkness that felt deliberate. The forest hummed with unseen life, and somewhere beyond the tree line came the faint rhythm of footsteps, slow, steady, impossibly familiar. A chill crawled up Lena's spine as she moved to the window. She pressed her face to the glass, staring into the void between the trees. Something moved there. Something tall. Something waiting. The wind rose again, carrying a whisper that curled around her like a memory she never wanted to remember. "Love brought you back. Blood will keep you here." Lena Harrow had always avoided the Black Mountains, even when the rest of her life fell apart and she had nowhere else to run. The place carried a weight she had never learned to name, only fear. It was the last place she had seen her mother alive, the last place she had felt truly safe before safety turned into a memory too painful to touch. But when the call came from the small mountain town lawyer informing her that the family cabin was still legally hers and needed to be claimed or sold, she realized there was no avoiding it anymore. Returning felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability slowly tightening around her life. The drive through the winding mountain roads was unnervingly quiet, the trees rising taller and darker the deeper she went, their branches twisting like skeletal arms reaching for something just out of sight. The radio lost its signal long before she reached the town limits, leaving only the sound of tires crunching gravel and the steady thump of her own heartbeat. The town itself looked smaller than she remembered, but older too, as though time had gathered in its corners and settled into the wood of every porch and window frame. People paused mid-conversation as she passed, their faces sharpening with recognition quickly replaced by unease. A woman sweeping the steps of the general store tightened her grip on the broom, staring at Lena as though she were a ghost walking in daylight. A man smoking beside the gas station muttered something under his breath and refused to meet her eyes. It wasn't hostility exactly, it was fear disguised as politeness. Fear that thickened the air around her. When Lena stepped into the attorney's office, even he hesitated before shaking her hand, as though the act itself carried risk. He spoke quickly, professionally, but she caught the cracks in his composure whenever her mother's name came up. It was as if the woman he had known decades ago still lingered in the room, or worse, still lingered in the woods. As Lena signed the papers, it became clear the townspeople viewed her return as an omen rather than a homecoming. They whispered as she passed, their eyes flicking to the tree line and back to her, as if waiting for something to follow her out of the forest. The tension crawled beneath her skin, making her wonder whether they feared her, pitied her, or expected her to meet the same fate her mother had faced. Still, she continued toward the cabin, the weight of unfinished history drawing her deeper into the mountains, each step feeling less like a return and more like a pull from something that had been waiting for her all along. The cabin felt heavier on the inside than its weathered exterior suggested, as if the walls had absorbed every unspoken secret left behind. Dust coated the furniture in a thin grey veil, and the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like pressed flowers long dead. Lena moved slowly through each room, afraid to disturb the stillness, afraid of what might surface if she lingered too long. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, only trying to convince herself that this place was nothing more than a forgotten shelter in the woods. But the truth had a way of revealing itself in the Black Mountains. It started when she tried to open the old wardrobe in her mother's bedroom. The door jammed halfway, as though something inside resisted her. After pushing harder, the wood finally gave with a brittle crack. Behind a row of moth-eaten coats, Lena noticed a false wooden panel slightly misaligned with the rest. The edges were worn smooth, as if touched repeatedly by someone who didn't want to be seen. She dug her fingers into the seam and pulled. A breath of cold, stale air drifted out, carrying the scent of lavender and old paper. Hidden in the hollow space was a trunk, small, heavy, and locked with a clasp that had tarnished into a dull green. Her mother's initials were carved into the lid, but the letters looked shaky, as though etched in haste or fear. Lena's chest tightened as she lifted it and set it on the bed. She expected old keepsakes, maybe photographs, maybe journals. What she didn't expect were letters, dozens of them, tied with fraying twine. The envelopes were yellowing, some edges burned or torn, each addressed in her mother's careful handwriting to someone named Elias. A name Lena had never heard spoken in her family. She untied the bundle and opened the first letter. Her mother's voice spilled onto the page, shaky but intimate, describing a kind of love Lena couldn't understand, love that was overwhelming, consuming, and frightening. Her mother wrote about a presence in the woods, a figure she claimed to have met when she was a girl, a figure she loved but feared, a figure that wasn't entirely human. She wrote of a pact made generations ago, binding the Harrow bloodline to something ancient that lived beneath the canopy of the Black Mountains. A pact forged through love but maintained through sacrifice. Each letter grew darker, revealing her mother's struggle between wanting to protect Lena and wanting to return to the entity she called her beloved. One page ended abruptly, the ink smeared as if the writing had stopped mid-sentence, leaving Lena with a sense of dread curling in her stomach. As she sifted through the trunk, a single realization sank in: her mother hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken by something that believed love and blood were the same price, and Lena's return meant that price was owed again. The first night in the cabin was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, as if the forest were holding its breath while watching her settle into a home that no longer belonged to the living. Lena tried to distract herself by organizing the dusty kitchen, but every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind made her pause, listening for something she couldn't name. When night finally swallowed the mountains, she sat on the couch with the bundle of her mother's letters beside her, unable to bring herself to open another one. The silence pressed in so tightly it felt almost deliberate, as if the woods were waiting for her to fall asleep. But when the whispers began, she knew sleep would not come easily. At first, it was faint, barely a sound at all, more like a soft shift in the air. She thought it might be the wind slipping through the cracked window frame, but then the whisper sharpened, curling into something unmistakably human. It carried her name, drawn out gently, the way her mother used to say it when calming her after nightmares. Lena froze, her skin prickling with a sudden cold that didn't belong to the room. She stood, heart pounding, straining to hear it again. For a moment, the cabin fell silent. Then the voice came once more, drifting from the forest beyond the back door, soft and melodic, humming the familiar lullaby her mother used to sing. A lullaby she hadn't heard since she was a child, a lullaby her mother sang the last night before she vanished. Lena stepped toward the window overlooking the tree line. The darkness was dense, almost physical, and yet she felt something move within it, something brushing lightly against her awareness. Each note of the lullaby seemed to tug at a memory she had spent years trying to bury. She told herself it was impossible, that the mind played tricks when faced with grief and fear, but the melody was too precise, too intimate, to be imagined. The whispers grew clearer, overlapping with the song, forming words she couldn't fully make out but recognized in her bones. They weren't coming from the cabin. They were coming from the woods, carried by a voice that sounded achingly familiar yet layered with something older, deeper, and nothing like human warmth. When the lullaby stopped abruptly, the silence felt sharper than any sound. Lena stumbled back from the window, chest tight, unable to shake the sensation that something outside had been waiting for her to listen, waiting for her to respond. She kept hearing her name echoing faintly in her mind, as if the forest were still whispering it beneath its breath, promising that the voice would return. It was then she realized that the woods remembered her, and they did not intend to let her forget them either. The next morning arrived with a pale, washed-out light that barely pierced the fog drifting through the trees. Lena had barely slept, her mind replaying the whispers and the lullaby until she wasn't sure which parts she had actually heard and which parts her exhausted imagination had supplied. She stepped outside hoping fresh air would steady her, but the forest felt colder than before, the silence sharper, as if something had withdrawn into the deeper shadows to watch her from a distance. She forced herself down the old path toward town, needing answers, needing anything that might make sense of the night. The trail felt narrower than she remembered, and several times she thought she heard twigs snapping behind her, but whenever she turned, nothing moved. Just trees, tall and still, like sentinels with hollow eyes. When she reached the edge of the woods near the creek, she noticed a figure crouched beside a fallen tree. At first she thought it was an animal, but then the figure straightened, revealing a man with weathered skin, layered clothing, and eyes that held the sharpness of someone who had spent far too long in the wilderness. He watched her with an intensity that made her stop several steps away. His beard was streaked with gray, his posture wary but not threatening, as if he expected her arrival. Without greeting her, he asked her name, his voice rough, like gravel dragged across stone. When she hesitated, he finished it for her, saying Lena Harrow with the certainty of someone who had known it long before she was born. She felt her stomach twist, but before she could demand how he knew her, the man lifted a hand, gesturing toward the dense forest behind her. He said the mountains had been restless since she returned, that the woods carried her blood like a scent and that something old had awakened to follow it. His words were strange, unsettling, spoken with the conviction of someone who wasn't warning her but reminding her of a truth she had forgotten. When he mentioned her mother, Lena took a step back, shaken by the familiarity in his tone. He claimed to have seen her mother walking the edges of the forest years after she vanished, moving silently through the trees as if guided by something unseen. He warned Lena that the same force was watching her now, drawn not by curiosity but by obligation. She didn't know whether to believe him, but the way he looked past her shoulder into the woods made her skin crawl. He told her not to walk alone after dark, not to answer any voice that called her name, no matter how familiar it sounded. Then he turned away, disappearing into the forest with the ease of someone who belonged to it, leaving Lena standing alone with the disturbing realization that he had not been afraid of her, but afraid for her, as though he knew exactly what had come back with her when she returned to the Black Mountains. Lena returned to the cabin with the hunter's warning gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, but the unease twisting in her chest only deepened as she stepped inside. The air felt thicker, as if the walls had inhaled while she was gone and were holding their breath again, waiting for her next move. She tried to distract herself by searching through old drawers, hoping to find something normal, receipts, photographs, anything that belonged to a life untouched by the strange. Instead, she found the portrait. It hung crookedly on the far wall behind a layer of dust so thick she almost missed it. At first glance, it looked like any old family painting, its frame chipped and faded, the canvas cracked with age. But the moment she wiped the dust away, her pulse stuttered in her throat. The woman in the portrait looked exactly like her. Not a resemblance or a shared feature, but an uncanny mirror, same wide-set eyes, same dark hair curling at the ends, same sharp jawline. Even the expression was one Lena had seen in her own reflection, a mixture of quiet hesitation and something guarded. Her breath caught as she leaned closer. The date in the bottom corner read 1889. Nearly a century before her mother was born, long before her family records mentioned anything about life in the Black Mountains. She searched the cabin for an explanation, combing through drawers and shelves as dust swirled in the stale light. There were no other paintings, no signatures matching the initials on the corner of the canvas, no notes about ancestors who might have lived here. But what unsettled her most was the feeling that the woman in the portrait wasn't just an ancestor. The eyes felt too alive, too knowing, as if they had been waiting for her to return. When she brought the portrait into the light, she realized the brushstrokes were unusually precise, capturing details no artist of the era should have been able to paint with such eerie sharpness. A delicate pattern traced the woman's neckline, almost like a mark or symbol. Lena touched her own skin unconsciously, feeling around for something that wasn't there but felt like it should be. As she examined the painting further, she noticed faint shapes in the background, trees twisted in unnatural curves, shadows forming the vague outline of a figure standing behind the woman, barely visible unless seen from a particular angle. The locals' fearful glances began to make sense in a way that chilled her. They hadn't been reacting to her, they had been reacting to the face they had seen before, the face that belonged to a woman who shouldn't have been remembered, yet clearly was. Lena felt the weight of generations pressing against her shoulders, and for the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a place her mother had abandoned. It felt like a place her bloodline had been circling back to for far too long, a place waiting for her because it recognized her, even before she recognized herself. The discovery of the portrait unsettled Lena so deeply that she found herself wandering restlessly through the cabin, unable to stay still for more than a few minutes. Every corner felt charged with a presence she couldn't see but could almost feel brushing her skin, as though the walls remembered her face before she ever stepped inside. The letters, the whispers, the portrait, it all pointed toward something rooted far deeper than memory. Something ancient. Needing answers, Lena grabbed a flashlight and stepped back outside, drawn toward the woods by a pull she couldn't explain. The forest was dim despite the afternoon sun, the canopy thick enough to swallow most of the light. The path behind the cabin, barely visible beneath layers of leaves, seemed to beckon her forward. She hesitated only a second before following it, the air growing colder with every step, the trees clustering together in ways that felt intentional, almost protective, almost possessive. As she moved deeper, she noticed markings on some of the trunks, carved runes she didn't recognize, their edges worn as if shaped long ago by hands that understood something she did not. The symbols repeated every few yards, forming a pattern that narrowed into a single direction. Her mother had mentioned symbols in one of the letters, warnings written in a trembling script about places in the forest that didn't belong to humans anymore. Lena's chest tightened at the thought, but she kept walking, driven by the same instinct that had compelled her mother to hide secrets instead of abandoning them. The trail eventually descended into a ravine she didn't remember ever seeing as a child. The air there felt different, still, heavy, as if sound itself refused to settle. Her flashlight beam caught smooth stone surfaces partially buried beneath moss, revealing shapes that didn't match the natural contours of the land. As she swept the light across the ravine floor, she saw them clearly, 2 stone altars, side by side, cracked with age yet unmistakably crafted. Dark stains marred their surfaces, stains too deep in color to be mere shadows or weathering. A cold shiver crept along her spine as she stepped closer, her throat tightening with a mix of dread and fascination. The ground around the altars was scattered with remnants of flowers, dried leaves woven into strange patterns, and bones, small bones arranged in a spiral formation. Something about the arrangement felt ritualistic, purposeful, preserved in a way nature wouldn't have done on its own. Lena crouched beside one of the stones, tracing the carved grooves with trembling fingers. The lines formed the same runes she had seen on the trees, but here they were clearer, sharper, as if etched by something stronger than human hands. She felt watched again, but this time the sensation was overwhelming, pressing against her thoughts like a presence that had been waiting for this moment. The forest seemed to lean inward, holding its breath. And for the first time, Lena felt certain the altars weren't relics of the past, they were warnings left behind for those who shared her blood, warnings she had been meant to find. The deeper Lena ventured into the ravine, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of earth and something faintly metallic, like blood long dried into stone. She felt an almost magnetic pull toward the far edge where the shadows gathered most densely, twisting among the trees and rocks. Her flashlight trembled in her grip, the beam flickering across gnarled roots and moss-covered stones. That's when she first sensed it, not just a presence, but the awareness of someone watching, something patient and deliberate. At first, it felt like the wind moving unnaturally, brushing her hair and shoulders, whispering through the trees, until a voice coiled around her senses in a way that made her knees buckle. It was soft at first, a murmur carried on the current of the forest, yet undeniably intimate. Lena, it breathed, elongated and tender, the syllables curling into her ear as though meant to soothe. Her heartbeat stuttered violently, a jolt of recognition that made her gasp. The words were familiar, too familiar. They were exactly the same as those recorded in her mother's letters, the same inflection, the same tone of dark devotion. Lena froze, gripping her flashlight like a lifeline, straining to see into the dense shadows. A form began to emerge, tall and indistinct, as if made of mist and moonlight. Its edges shimmered unnaturally, the shape flickering as though reality itself refused to hold it in one place. The figure stepped closer, not with the heavy sound of feet, but with the silent grace of something that had learned to move with the forest, to blend with the air. Lena could see only glimpses, the glint of eyes that seemed almost human but held a depth of ages, the faint outline of a smile that was both welcoming and dangerous. And then the voice spoke again, close enough now that Lena could feel it brushing her skin. It spoke in the same intimate, seductive tone, reciting lines her mother had written in ink decades ago, lines about devotion, sacrifice, and the inevitability of blood owed. Lena's chest tightened. She realized this was the beloved her mother had feared and loved in equal measure, the entity that had bound their bloodline across generations. It whispered words of longing, calling her not just by name, but by memory and lineage, a pull that made her heart ache and her mind reel. The forest seemed to lean in, holding the encounter in suspended tension. Lena wanted to run, yet her body betrayed her, rooted by the weight of recognition and a strange, irresistible curiosity. Every instinct screamed danger, yet the voice wove itself into her awareness, promising connection, understanding, and a darkness she could neither flee from nor fully comprehend. It spoke of love entwined with blood, devotion entwined with doom, and for the first time, Lena understood the magnitude of the curse she had inherited, a curse that was alive, waiting, and now, undeniably near. The truth hit Lena like a cold, sharp wind, cutting through the fog of uncertainty that had clouded her mind since she arrived in the Black Mountains. The entity in the forest was not a random presence or a malevolent spirit, it was a force older than any living memory in the town, a being bound to her family through a pact forged generations ago. As she pieced together her mother's letters, the carvings on the trees, and the markings around the stone altars, a pattern emerged. Her ancestor, a woman whose name had been all but erased from the family's history, had encountered this forest-dwelling entity long before Lena's mother was born. She had fallen in love with it, entranced by its power, its mystery, its promise of protection and knowledge. But love, Lena realized, had been a trap. The entity demanded devotion in exchange for that protection, a devotion that came with a price measured in blood, loyalty, and sacrifice. Each generation, the entity required a Harrow to return to the mountains, to submit to its strange, consuming affection, to maintain the covenant or risk the consequences. Lena's mother had resisted, had tried to shield Lena from the curse, but the forest had a memory, a way of tracking bloodlines, of waiting patiently for the next heir. Lena understood now why her mother's letters had grown darker with each page, why the warnings had been written with trembling hands. Her mother had been trapped in the impossible choice between love and freedom, between survival and the inevitability of the entity's claim. The words on the pages came alive in her mind, describing the forest as a sentient force, capable of sensing intent, capable of exacting punishment for those who strayed. The letters detailed her mother's encounters with fleeting glimpses of the entity, the way it spoke with a voice both comforting and menacing, how it could manipulate the trees, the wind, even the thoughts of those who entered its domain. Lena began to understand the true nature of the whispers she had heard, the lullabies that had called her name in the night. They were not mere echoes of memory, they were invitations, temptations designed to draw her deeper into the forest's grasp, into the cycle of devotion and blood. She traced her fingers over the carved runes again, seeing them now not just as symbols but as warnings, mechanisms to bind the Harrow bloodline to the entity. The love her ancestor had felt had been real, but the entity's love was different, possessive, eternal, insatiable, an inescapable force that conflated affection with control. Lena's heart pounded as she realized the weight she carried. She was next, the inevitable heir of a curse that demanded she choose between yielding to the forest's dark devotion or breaking the bond entirely, knowing that either path could reshape or destroy everything that remained of her family's line. The discovery of her mother's final act came slowly, almost unbearably, as Lena sifted through the last of the letters and remnants of the hidden trunk. Each page seemed to pulse with urgency, her mother's fear and resolve etched in every line, as though the paper itself had absorbed the tension of the mountains. Lena read how her mother had come to understand that resistance alone would not save her, that the entity's patience was infinite and its power relentless. The mountains had watched her mother, guided her, and at the end, demanded a choice she could not escape. Her mother's words revealed the depth of her sacrifice. She had deliberately allowed herself to be claimed, to delay the entity's attention from reaching Lena, ensuring her daughter would have the chance to arrive unscathed, unmarked, at least for a little while longer. The thought made Lena's chest tighten. Her mother had vanished not out of cowardice or neglect but because she had made the ultimate decision to protect her child. The letters described the night in meticulous detail, recounting the moments when the forest seemed to breathe around her mother, when shadows coalesced into shapes that whispered promises of devotion, and when the entity's presence pressed against her body and soul. Yet through it all, her mother had stood firm, offering herself as the vessel to contain the curse, a living shield against a force that had claimed so many before her. Lena felt tears burn in her eyes as she imagined her mother moving silently through the trees, aware of every step, every rustle of leaves, every flicker of the entity's attention. The thought that her mother had been both victim and protector gave Lena a mixture of grief and awe that pressed down like the very weight of the mountains themselves. Her mother's final letter contained instructions, written not in panic but in deliberate care, guiding Lena to understand the cycle she had inherited and hinting at choices that could alter its course. It spoke of boundaries within the forest, of runes and altars, of whispers that must not be obeyed blindly, and of the need to recognize the entity's affection for what it was, both love and prison intertwined. It was clear her mother had delayed the inevitable, but she could not break it entirely, and now the responsibility passed to Lena. The letters ended abruptly, ink smudged as though a trembling hand had been interrupted, leaving her with a stark, terrifying clarity. Her mother's disappearance had been an act of courage and calculation, a final gambit to ensure Lena's survival for however long the forest would allow. Lena's fingers lingered on the last page, the words sinking into her mind like roots into soil. The forest beyond the cabin seemed to shift, to pulse in rhythm with her realization, almost as though it recognized the acknowledgement of what her mother had done. She felt both the weight and the urgency of the inheritance, the pull of a curse kept at bay by a single sacrifice, and the undeniable truth that she was now standing on the precipice her mother had once stood upon, facing the same force with the knowledge that her own choices would determine the survival or destruction of her bloodline. Lena stood at the edge of the forest, the shadows stretching like dark fingers around her, the weight of her bloodline pressing down on her chest. Everything she had uncovered, the letters, the runes, the altars, and her mother's ultimate sacrifice, culminated in a single, inescapable truth. The curse was not merely a story of the past, it was a living force demanding repayment, and now it was her turn. The forest seemed to watch, patient and eternal, aware of her presence and her hesitation. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to leave the mountains and never return, but she knew the entity's reach was far greater than she could imagine. Running might delay the inevitable, but it could never truly sever the bond that coursed through her veins, the same bond that had bound her mother and countless generations before her. As she walked deeper into the woods, following the faint glow of moonlight filtering through twisted branches, Lena felt the air grow colder and the sounds of the night more vivid. Each snapping twig and rustling leaf seemed to carry a warning or perhaps a temptation. Then, she saw it, a shadow moving among the trees, tall and elegant, its presence commanding yet disarmingly intimate. The entity stepped forward, its form becoming clearer in the silvery light, eyes glinting with recognition, a voice that was both velvet and steel slipping into her mind. It spoke of devotion, of love, of the destiny written in her blood. It reminded her that the Harrows had always been intertwined with the forest, that the price of defiance was steep, and that embracing it could bring power, understanding, and connection beyond mortal comprehension. Lena's thoughts raced, the weight of generations pressing upon her. She could hear her mother's voice in her memory, in the letters, in the lullabies whispered through the cabin walls, warning her of the danger, teaching her caution, teaching her how to survive. The choice before her was clear yet impossible. She could submit, joining the entity as its next beloved and continuing the cycle of devotion that had defined her lineage, or she could attempt to break the bond, sever the curse entirely, knowing that doing so might destroy her family line forever, erase the protection her mother had bought at the cost of her own life, and invite the entity's wrath in full. Every fiber of her being trembled as she realized the magnitude of her decision. She could feel the forest leaning closer, listening, aware of her indecision, aware of the blood coursing through her veins, aware of the power that waited for acknowledgement. Lena knew that whatever choice she made, nothing would remain the same, not the mountains, not the forest, not the echoes of her family's past, and certainly not herself. The entity's presence pressed upon her mind like a tide, patient yet unyielding, a reminder that love and blood had always been intertwined, and now the burden, the consequence, and the choice rested squarely on her shoulders.